Good day. Today is Monday, 21st April 2025, the day after Easter Day, as in the Eastern Orthodox Church we say, Christ is risen. And let me again say to everybody who celebrates this holiday and those who don't, happy Easter to all of you, and peace and goodwill to everybody who's following these programs, and indeed to everybody everywhere. Now, as it happens, this Easter was the last Easter celebrated by Pope Francis. Earlier today, reports circulated, were confirmed in fact, by the Vatican that he has passed away. I'm not going to discuss in this program Pope Francis's religious activities, his pastoral work, his doctrinal positions, which I know are controversial with some people. Since I am not a Catholic, I don't think it is proper for me to discuss discussions and debates and even arguments that take place in a church that is not my own. What I would say is that on foreign policy issues, which of course for me, for this channel, for this program, they are the main topic of discussion. On foreign policy issues, it seems to me that Pope Francis's positions really cannot be faulted. He has been a consistent advocate of peace in Ukraine. He has rejected all attempts to push the Western narrative about the origins of the conflict in Ukraine. I have great sympathy and understanding and agreement with the positions that Pope Francis adopted over the conflicts in the Middle East, including with Gaza. And there is little more that I can say on that, other than to say that, as far as I'm concerned, if only for that reason, Pope Francis is somebody I will miss and greatly miss, as a man of peace and as somebody who promoted peace. Now, of course, the Catholic Church, the cardinals, will now go through the complex process of electing a successor. We will see whether this successor follows the line on foreign policy issues that Pope Francis himself has done. So, again, I'm happy that Pope Francis at least was able to celebrate Easter, and I'm sorry, very sorry for his passing. I wish his friends and family, about whom I know little, but I wish them all goodwill, and for the rest, I don't think there's more really that I can say. Now, let us turn now to the perennial topics of these programs: the conflict in Ukraine, and the wider conflict between the United States and the Western powers and Russia, and the conflict in the Middle East, which of course continues, but with some signs of progress in the negotiations between the United States and Iran. I say some signs of progress, but the difficulty with these negotiations, the negotiations between the United States and Iran, just as with the negotiations between the United States and Russia, is that these negotiations have acquired a complexity that they really do not need. In my opinion, both the Ukraine conflict and the conflict with Iran, at least the nuclear issue part of the conflict with Iran, ought to be ripe for relatively straightforward solutions. But of course, it never turns out that way. Any negotiation that the United States becomes involved in ends up involving any number of different stakeholders, including within the United States itself. The result is that the negotiations when they begin with the other side, be it the Russians or the Iranians, become overcomplicated and unbelievably protracted, and often subject to intense disappointment. And obvious solutions, or at least solutions which to me seem to be obvious, become incredibly difficult to achieve. At this point, I'm going to repeat again my observation about repeat again my references, my numerous references to that article that Eve Smith wrote long ago about how the United States and its allies, whenever they prepare for a negotiation with some other party, firstly engage in protracted negotiations with each other in order to arrive at some sort of consensus position. In the process, they almost entirely lose sight of what the other party to the negotiations thinks or wants, so that when the consensus position is eventually reached after very difficult internal negotiations, it is no longer fit for purpose, and is one that almost immediately becomes clear, is unacceptable to the other party. I've seen this process repeat itself time and again. Eve Smith is absolutely right, and I'm going to say that we are going through a particularly spectacular example of all of this with the Ukraine negotiations, to the extent that there are actually any Ukraine negotiations underway at all. Now, before I get on to all of that, I think, though, the most important point to start with is this Easter ceasefire that was announced by President Putin on Friday, and which lasted for 30 hours, and which took a lot of people by surprise, though it shouldn't have done so, because President Putin has in the past floated the idea of ceasefires during religious holidays, Orthodox religious holidays. Back in 2023, I believe, he announced a unilateral ceasefire over the period of the Orthodox Christmas. Ukraine, by the way, refused to observe that ceasefire. He's floated possibilities of such ceasefires on other occasions, and, well, he did this again, this time over Easter. This is not such a new thing for him. And the reason he does this, one of the reasons that he does this, is no doubt because, as a religious man himself, he does believe that people, religious believers who are involved in the war, should be enabled to celebrate Easter in peace. And this is, I'm sure, one of the reasons why he announced the ceasefire. But a further reason is that he undoubtedly, on the eve of these holidays, comes under pressure from the Russian Orthodox Church, which is particularly anxious to broker these ceasefires, or to see these ceasefires take effect, because, of course, it knows that there are Orthodox Christians fighting on both sides, and it feels a pastoral duty towards them. Now, President Putin is in close contact with the Orthodox Church, an institution little understood in the West, if I may say, and whose influence and importance within Russian society is also little understood. My understanding is that Putin himself has his own contacts with a particular priest of the Orthodox Church, to whom he regularly makes confession. So he is somebody who is going to listen to the Orthodox Church. He probably feels a personal religious obligation to do so. And he probably understands that the church does speak for a significant section of Russian society. Just saying. Now, I'm not going to, in this program, by the way, and I want to say this immediately, I don't intend to discuss in detail the position of the Orthodox Church in Russia. Suffice to say that Russia is essentially a secular society, but that doesn't mean that the church isn't popular or that it doesn't have much support within Russian society. Around 2/3 of Russians now declare themselves Orthodox Christians. But obviously there's an awful lot to say about this topic, and I'm not going to devote this program to doing so, because if I did, that would take up the whole of the program and would be something very much at variance with the topics that this program is dedicated to discussing, which are geopolitical and strategic and diplomatic ones. But anyway, these factors undoubtedly did play a role in Putin's decision to announce this ceasefire. But there were political aspects to this also. And we can find this in Putin's comments about the ceasefire, which he made at a meeting which took place on Good Friday, when he met with the chief of the General Staff and overall military commander of the Russian forces conducting the military operations in Ukraine, and by the way in Kursk and Belgorod regions, who is of course General Valery Gerasimov. And anyway, this is what Putin said. Today is the eve of Easter, and I would like to congratulate on this bright holiday, first and foremost, servicemen who are Orthodox Christians and who have been fighting for Russia. I would like to wish a happy Easter to everyone in our country and around the world who celebrates, observes, and respects this holiday. Guided by humanitarian motives, the Russian side announces an Easter ceasefire from 6 p.m. today, that is 6 p.m. on Good Friday, to 12 a.m. Monday. I hereby order all military operations ceased for this period. We assume, notice that word, assume, that the Ukrainian side will follow our example. At the same time, our troops should be prepared to repel ceasefire violations and provocations by the enemy, as well as any aggressive acts on their part. We are well aware of the fact the Kiev regime, as you reported to me, violated agreements on refraining from targeting energy infrastructure facilities more than 100 times. Therefore, I ask you to be extremely attentive and focused to be ready to strike back in full. Our decision on the Easter truce will demonstrate whether the Kiev regime is sincere, ready and willing to comply with the agreements, to participate in peace negotiations aimed at addressing the root causes of the Ukrainian crisis. For our part, we have always been ready to move in this direction and strongly welcome the aspirations of the US President, our Chinese friends, the President of the People's Republic of China, the BRICS countries, and all supporters of a just and peaceful settlement of the Ukraine crisis. Now, we can unpack this, and we can do this fairly quickly. So, first of all, Putin talks about the fact that the ceasefire has, first and foremost, humanitarian motives. It is intended, in other words, to do what I said, to allow soldiers on both sides, especially soldiers who are Orthodox Christians, to celebrate the Easter holiday. It is a decision fitting for the nature of the holiday, which is, by the way, I should just say, Easter is particularly important for Orthodox Christians. it remains for Orthodox Christians, in most respects, a more important holiday than Christmas is. Christmas being, in my experience, the more important holiday for many people within the Western churches. Just saying. But there is a political aspect to this as well. Our Easter truce will demonstrate whether the Kiev regime is sincere, ready, willing, and able to comply with the agreements to participate in peace negotiations aimed at addressing the root causes of the crisis. So, what Putin is saying is, look, we had this energy truce. It was supposed to last for 30 days. It has expired. It expired, according to the Russians, on the 16th of April. The Ukrainians conducted and continue to conduct many attacks on Russian energy infrastructure. Those attacks have never slackened and never ceased. We're giving the Ukrainians another opportunity to show that they are capable of complying with ceasefires. We're announcing this Easter ceasefire. It is, in other words, a test for the Ukrainians. If the Ukrainians fully comply with the ceasefire, if they entirely stop firing on our positions, then we will know, we will be able to see that they are serious about desiring peace. But if they do attack us, if they do continue to fire upon us, well, then that will show the opposite. And here again, we can see that what Putin is doing on the eve of the next visit, which he must be anticipating, from Steve Witkoff, which is likely to come over the course of this week, he is preparing his response. He wants to be in a position where he can tell Witkoff, well, you come to me, you're asking me for ceasefires, you want me to agree to ceasefires, and look what happens. Firstly, we had the energy ceasefire, the agreed truce on attacks on the energy systems, and the Ukrainians violated this repeatedly. And I, myself, as a goodwill gesture, announced a unilateral ceasefire over Easter, but the Ukrainians did not comply with it, which shows that they simply cannot be trusted with ceasefires. So when you come to me and you tell me that you want me, Russia, to agree to an unconditional ceasefire with Ukraine, well, we now have proof that unconditional ceasefires of the kind that you have been proposing, you, the Americans, have been proposing, simply won't work because Ukraine doesn't honor them. So that is one thing that Putin said. And he also said that it will also test Ukraine's sincerity and ability to comply with agreements reached as a result of peace negotiations aimed at addressing the root causes of the Ukrainian crisis. Note again that reference to root causes of the Ukrainian crisis. In other words, Putin is doing what the Russians have consistently done right up to this moment. He is coming and saying that a ceasefire by itself simply will not do, even if it is observed. We've been here before. We've been here with the Minsk Agreement, which declared a ceasefire which was never fully honored, but which resulted in a kind of freezing of the conflict for 7 years. Over that time, the Ukrainians rearmed and re-equipped and built up their forces. And as a result, at the end of that process, the war resumed on a much bigger scale than it had before. This time, there must be a full, complete agreement, which addresses the root causes of the conflict. And the root causes are the nature of the government in Kiev, the way it came to power as a result of what Putin calls an unconstitutional and a violent coup. And on that, by the way, I completely agree with him, just to make that absolutely clear. The policies that government has followed ever since, which is all about the eradication of Russian influence, Russian culture, Russian language in Ukraine and Ukrainian society, the attempt to pursue a monocultural vision of Ukraine, as discussed by, amongst others, Richard Sackwer, the British historian, in various extremely erudite studies that he has done of Ukrainian policy since the Maidan Revolution, or Maidan coup, if you prefer. And also, of course, that means taking steps to ensure that Ukraine does not become a military instrument of the West. It must not ever join NATO. It must not have armed forces on a scale that can threaten Russia. It must not be put in a position where Russia's military position, its territories, its peace can be threatened, and its security can be threatened by Ukraine, whether in alliance with the Western powers or by itself at any point in the future. And of course, that takes us back to the initial provisions, the terms that Putin set out when he launched the special military operation, which was protection for the people of Donetsk and Lugansk and for the independence of those territories. Today, their inclusion in the Russian Federation, denuclearization in Ukraine, demilitarization in Ukraine, and what Putin and the Russians refer to as denazification in Ukraine as well. The elimination of all the political groups, the armed groups and political groups that subscribe to the ideology of Stepan Bandera, or even more radical individuals from the 1930s and 1940s, and essentially the transformation of Ukraine into a peaceful, neutral, disarmed country, one which has forsworn violence, forsworn threats against Russia, that no longer has armed forces that can threaten Russia, or a potential nuclear capability with which it can in future threaten Russia. And Putin has, in the past, pointed out that the Istanbul Agreement of April 2022 essentially addressed all of those points, and he has made it clear that though he is prepared overall to return to what was agreed in Istanbul in April 2022, now, given the direction the war has taken, given the events on the ground, the fact that the four regions are now recognized by Russia as part of Russian territory, that the provisions must go beyond that and must now amount to what I have referred to as Istanbul Plus. In other words, the conditions that Putin set out in his speech to the Russian Foreign Ministry on 14th of June 2024, the demand that all of the provisions of the April 2022 Istanbul Agreement, no membership of NATO, neutral status, denuclearization, demilitarization, ultimately denazification, though that was not apparently fully agreed in Istanbul, but also now the complete transfer of the four territories of Zaporozhye, Kherson, Donetsk and Lugansk to Russia, going beyond the contact line that existed then, or which exists now, and certainly beyond the ceasefire line that existed at the end of the fighting in February 2015. Just saying. So this is what Putin has set out, and when he uses the word root causes, that is what he means. And there is no sign here that he is prepared to retreat from that. He gives no indication of doing so. Note that he continues to speak of the Kiev regime, for example, and he makes the point that the Kiev regime has not complied with ceasefires in the past, and he clearly didn't expect that the Kiev regime, as he described it, would comply with the Easter ceasefire either. Well, in that expectation, I would suggest that he was proved largely right. Now, Ukraine, Zelensky responded to Putin's proposal for an Easter ceasefire very much along the lines of what one might expect. Zelensky initially, when directly after Putin made the proposal, appeared to reject it. He said that this wasn't a real ceasefire. The ceasefire that he wanted was the full 30-day ceasefire that his negotiators, against his wishes, by the way, agreed at the meeting in Jeddah in March. So he wants a full ceasefire, also he says, without any other conditions. He won't set out in any detail what he expects to come from that ceasefire, but that's the ceasefire that he wants. And he indicated that he would not agree to this particular ceasefire. This was just a PR move. And then a few hours later, he shifted position. And I expect that the reason for that was that the telephone calls started from London, Paris, Berlin, and Brussels. They all told him that if he starts rejecting ceasefires of any sort, it won't play well with the Americans. It might put Ukraine in a more awkward position. So very grudgingly, Zelensky said that Ukraine would mirror the ceasefire. He didn't exactly say, in other words, that Ukraine was joining the ceasefire. He said that if the Russians didn't attack, the Ukrainians wouldn't do so either. So that would create some kind of regime of peace. Well, what then happened is that the fighting did indeed slacken for the 30 hours that Putin announced the ceasefire for. But here it's important to make the point that on the eve of the ceasefire, the Russians were attacking and the Ukrainians were defending. And in most positions, along the front lines, as is clear to anybody who has been following and tracking the fighting closely, the Ukrainians were not in a position themselves to launch further attacks upon the Russians. They had been struggling to hold their positions against Russian attacks. They've not really been in a position to go on the attack themselves. So, that there would be a slackening of the fighting is unsurprising, because the very fact that the Russians who were attacking before had stopped attacking would in and of itself mean that there was a general reduction in the fighting. But at least according to the Russian Defense Ministry, ultimately not very much difference. There was very much difference in what the Ukrainians were doing, because the Ukrainians, in fact, did continue to launch various attacks on the Russian forces over the 30 hours of the ceasefire, not in effect complying with it. I will read the statement of the Russian Defense Ministry. In accordance with the order of the Supreme Commander-in-Chief, who is of course Putin, all groups of forces deployed in the Special Military Operations Zone have been strictly observing the state of ceasefire from 1800 hours on 19th April to 0000 hours on 21st April, remaining in previously taken positions. Despite the announced Easter ceasefire, the Ukrainian armed forces continue to conduct artillery fire and strike by unmanned aerial vehicles against the positions of Russian troops, as well as civilian facilities in the border areas of Belgorod, Bryansk, Kursk, and the Republic of Crimea. In total, there were 4,900 ceasefire violations. The armed forces of Ukraine have attempted to launch attacks 6 times, including in the area of Sukhaya Balka, Bogatyr, Pershe Travnia, Belogorodka, and Tarasovka, as well as Oleshnia in Kursk region. All these attempts were repelled. The enemy employed 90 fixed-wing armed and unmanned aerial vehicles, 8 of them outside the special military operation zone during the ceasefire. All have been shot down. The enemy shelled Russian positions 1,404 times, using artillery pieces, multiple launch rocket systems and mortars, and carried out 3,316 strikes by quadrocopters. In the border areas of Bryansk, Kursk, and Belgorod region, 19 fire attacks, 49 strikes by FPV drones, and 16 ammunition drops from helicopter-type unmanned aerial vehicles. 25 strongholds of the Russian armed forces and 50 settlements were carried out from 1800 hours on the 19th of April until 0000 hours on the 21st of April. In general, during the daytime, the density of fire and operations by the enemy was significantly reduced along the front line. So the Russians admit that there was a reduction in military activity by the Ukrainians. The firing was reduced, but nonetheless, significant violations of the ceasefire did in fact take place. So that is what the Russian Defense Ministry says. Now, a couple of hours ago, late yesterday, after the hour when the ceasefire ended, after that hour, Putin's spokesman Peskov was asked whether the ceasefire would be extended, the Easter ceasefire would be extended, as Zelensky was asking, and Peskov said that no order to extend the ceasefire had come from Putin and that the ceasefire had therefore ended. So, as of midnight, Moscow time, yesterday, the Easter ceasefire is over. Putin has got what he wanted from it. He's got a humanitarian pause during Easter. Russian and Ukrainian troops who are Orthodox Christians have been able to worship mostly in peace during that time. But he's got further evidence that he can provide to the Americans that when ceasefires do come into force, the Ukrainians generally violate them. And they did so on numerous occasions. This time, even if overall the situation on the battlefronts during the period of the ceasefire was calmer. So, from Putin's point of view, the ceasefire served its purpose. Well, that doesn't take us further in any respect, in relation to the diplomacy. And here it continues to be the Americans who are making the running. We've had statements from Rubio, from Kellogg, from Witkoff. Witkoff is the latest American official to come out and say that the United States is now at the end of its patience in attempting to negotiate this peace. If this can't happen over the next couple of days, weeks, then the United States will just have to move on. So we have these statements from the United States. We also have a significant number of leaks that are appearing in the American media, in Bloomberg and in the Wall Street Journal, which give us a sense now of the proposal that the Americans are bringing to the table. Now, here I think a very important point needs to be made. Until very recently, until a few weeks ago, in all of the various discussions that the Americans had had with the Ukrainians and with the Russians, the Americans came forward with no proposal about how to end the war. In fact, about a week ago, the Russian Deputy Foreign Minister, Sergei Ryabkov, actually made a complaint about this. He said that the Americans had come to all kinds of meetings. They'd invariably discussed peripheral issues, the re-establishment of diplomatic contacts by putting the embassies in Moscow and Washington back on an operational footing. The Americans had also talked about ceasefires, a ceasefire in terms of attacks on energy infrastructure, a ceasefire in terms of, the revival of the Black Sea Initiative, that sort of thing. But the Americans had never actually put forward a proposal that actually addressed the core issues of the conflict. And the Russians have repeatedly said that they're not even prepared to consider a ceasefire unless there is actual movement towards a final settlement. There has to be a final agreement as to at least an outline agreement, a framework agreement, as to what the outlines of the final settlement will be, with some guarantee that that settlement will then be agreed and put into place before any serious discussion about a ceasefire can take place. Now, the Americans have been very, very divided about this, and this undoubtedly explains the delay, because the only proposal they have had, which they've discussed amongst themselves and which it appears Trump agreed to during the election period last year, was the proposal that Kellogg made back in his article, back when he wrote his article in April 2024. Since then, Witkoff has visited Moscow 3 times and has had meetings with Putin, and has also had lengthy meetings with Lavrov and Ushakov and Kirill Dmitriev, the head of the Russian Investment Fund. And he's come back and told Trump that the Russians fundamentally don't agree with the Kellogg plan. But the Kellogg plan has been the only actual plan in place. What Witkoff apparently proposed, which is straightforward acceptance of Putin's 14th June 2024 proposal, was apparently strongly opposed by Kellogg, with Kellogg telling Trump that the Ukrainians would never agree to Putin's June 2024 proposals. So Trump, very keen on a settlement as he is, and no doubt having long ago accepted the Kellogg plan as the framework, appears to have essentially signed off on it. He seems to have recognized that the Russians do insist upon a framework deal in place before they will even look at a ceasefire. The contention of people like Secretary Rubio that you first agree a ceasefire, then you enter into negotiations, then over the course of that ceasefire, you gradually work out the details, and then in a month or a year's time, after the fighting has ended, you agree the final details of the agreement. That will not do. The Russians will not go down that road. They've made that very clear, and Trump seems to have understood that. So over the last couple of weeks, perhaps as recently as last week, a decision was finally made that an actual settlement proposal, a proposal to settle the conflict, needed to be put together to be presented to the Russians in order to get them to agree to this ceasefire. And as I discussed in the program that I made previously, Trump seems to be now at the very limits of his patience, and he's told Rubio and Kellogg, well, this is your plan. You must now get it accepted by all the parties over the next few weeks, at least before the end of April. And if you don't get them all to accept it, well, enough's enough. I've got far too many other things to think about and worry about. I will simply walk away, and the United States will simply walk away. And there now appears to be a general acceptance within the highest levels of the American government that that is Trump's position. At least that's what they're telling everybody is Trump's position, and they are all endorsing it. Kellogg, Rubio, and Witkoff have all said that they support Trump's stance that if a deal is not agreed, if this agreement is not agreed within the next week or so, in other words, before the end of April, then the United States will indeed walk away. Now, as I discussed in my last program, the deal is essentially, in fact, almost entirely identical to Kellogg's original plan. But there are certain twists and there are certain nuances. It has been adjusted slightly in order to take into account Russian concerns. Now, some of these adjustments are less extensive than people imagine. So, for example, apparently, the Americans, the US is telling the Russians, or will tell the Russians, that if the Russians go ahead with this plan, the United States will formally recognize Crimea as Russian, as part of Russian territory. My recollection is that this was something that Kellogg himself was always in favor of. Just saying. So I don't think that is a departure from Kellogg's plan. There's also suggestions that sanctions relief will be provided to the Russians if they go along with this plan. Again, that seems to me identical with what Kellogg was proposing right from the start. The Americans are now saying that the question of Ukraine joining NATO has been taken off the table. I'm not completely clear what that is supposed to mean, but language that's being expressed by US officials, by Rubio, by Kellogg himself, imply that it's now agreed that Ukraine will never join NATO. The problem is that there don't seem to be any strong guarantees that that will remain the position. Just saying. So I don't myself imagine that this will be acceptable to the Russians in this form, because in the past we appeared to have categorical commitments that Ukraine would never join NATO. There were commitments to that effect when Ukraine became independent in 1991. It had a provision in its constitution that it would be a neutral country. For example, at that time, as is well known, the Western countries had anyway given assurances to Russia, to Moscow, to the Soviet Union that NATO would not be extended eastwards. So simply saying that Ukraine will not join NATO in the future is no different than what was said to the Russians back in the early 1990s when Ukraine became independent. And of course, the stance changed completely then. And what guarantee in the future is there that it will not be changed completely now? There is a small shift from Kellogg's position as set out in April 2024. At that time, Kellogg was talking about postponing discussions about Ukraine's eventual NATO membership for perhaps 10 or 20 years. He now seems to be conceding that Ukraine will never enter NATO at all, but the United States doesn't seem to be willing to make a legal commitment to that effect, or at least not one that would answer Russian concerns. So anyway, the difference is, as I said, that some people are seeing in these proposals from Kellogg's original plan, they don't really seem to be there to me. Now, there also seems to be a general misunderstanding about Russian proposals. I've now been reading in the American media that, for example, the Americans have now discovered that the Russians are calling for denazification in Ukraine. The Americans, in part correctly, take this to mean the disestablishment of Zelensky's government in Kiev. Absolutely, that is no doubt the case. But of course, it goes well beyond that. I've read that the Americans feel that this is a new demand that the Russians are making. This is not a new demand. It is there as part of Putin's original demands that he made when he launched the special military operation back in February 2022. In fact, it has been a demand that the Russians have consistently made, and they have never wavered from. So again, I don't understand why people think that this is new when it is not. There is one demand which the Russians, I think, are certain to reject, which is completely new, at least one new, not demand from the Americans, but one new proposal from the Americans, which I am confident the Russians will reject outright. We learned about this in the Wall Street Journal, which is that both the Russians and the Ukrainians give up control of the Zaporozhye nuclear power plant. It is managed by it is neutral. It is managed neutrally in the interests of both. And of course, it appears that the party that will manage it will be the United States. The Russians have already rejected any idea or proposal relating to the Zaporozhye nuclear power plant. They say that as far as they're concerned, it is Russian and there is nothing further to be said about it. Anyway, this is the American plan, and the American plan, as I understand it, is essentially as follows. And as I said, it is essentially Kellogg's plan. The conflict freezes along the current front lines. The Russians remain in indefinite occupation of the territory that they control in eastern Ukraine, including, by the way, their land bridge to Crimea, but they don't regain possession of Kherson city or of Zaporozhye city or of the towns of Slavyansk, Kramatorsk, Konstantinovka and Pokrovsk. So those places, despite the fact that the Russian constitution considers them to be Russian, remain under Ukrainian control. There is no provision whatever for limits on the size of the Ukrainian armed forces. The Ukrainian armed forces can remain at their present size, and consistent with Kellogg's proposal of April 2024, the United States is at complete liberty to rearm it. There are, however, no security guarantees provided by the United States to Ukraine. So Ukraine is essentially left on its own, but again, consistent with Kellogg's original April 2024 proposal, European troops enter Ukraine and establish some kind of security presence there, providing a kind of guarantee in place of NATO membership, which, as I've said, the United States is not formally kicking into the long grass, but effectively is, because whereas in April 2024, Kellogg spoke about Ukraine entering NATO in 20 years' time, possibly, today he's no longer doing that, but there is no guarantee provided to the Russians that this won't happen. Now, I said at the start of the program, going back to what Eve Smith said, that the Americans spent all their time negotiating with each other and with the Europeans, and in this case with the Ukrainians also, in order, before they present a plan to the other side, which the other side is then going to reject. And over the course of the next week, that apparently is exactly what is going to happen. Because, as I understand it, the idea is that over the course of this week, the Europeans and the Ukrainians are supposed to agree to this plan. Now, on the part of the Europeans, as I've already said, as I said in my previous program, I don't think they are going to offer any fundamental objections. They don't like this plan. They want a clear-cut military victory over the Russians. They want the Russians in Ukraine defeated and ground down, and they want regime change in Moscow, and they want all those things. This plan falls far short of that, and in that respect, as Viktor Orban, the Hungarian Prime Minister, has said, this is effectively a defeat. It is a military victory for the Russians. It concedes that the Russians have won in military terms, and it is a defeat for the European powers. But it is not such a complete defeat that they cannot live with it. And of course, they still hope ultimately to retrieve what they have been seeking from the conflict. They're going to send their troops, according to this plan, into Ukraine. Apparently, the American proposals say nothing about European peacekeepers. But then, as Macron has said, actual American agreement about this is not needed. If this plan were to take effect, it would be something that could be agreed by the Europeans and the Ukrainians with each other. Neither the Americans nor the Russians would need to be involved. So the Europeans can send their peacekeepers to Ukraine, and the British are committed, as Keir Starmer has said, to Ukraine's irreversible entry into NATO, course into NATO. So the Europeans can accept this plan and say to themselves, well, we didn't get the victory over the Russians that we wanted, but we've come out of it ultimately rather well. We're going to get Ukraine. One day Ukraine will join NATO. We're not going to recognize eastern Ukrainian territories under Russian control as Russian. We're going to continue our economic blockade, our economic war against Russia indefinitely, and eventually we will bend the Russians to our will. That, I suspect, is what the Europeans, at least the British and the French, and perhaps the Germans, are saying to each other. For Zelensky, this is a much more difficult proposal to accept. And if you listen to what he has been saying for the last 3 years, one would expect him to reject it. And perhaps he will. He has insisted on Ukraine's right to enter NATO. He has insisted on security guarantees. He has insisted on Ukraine's territorial integrity and the right to Ukraine's right to have all of its territory brought back under Ukrainian control. This proposal gives him none of those things. In addition, if it is correct that the United States is proposing to recognize Crimea as Russian, that would be an almost impossible thing for Zelensky to accept. If he signs off on an agreement which results in the United States recognizing Crimea as Russian, that would logically mean that Crimea would never become Ukrainian territory, because if the Americans agree that Crimea is Russian, there is no realistic prospect that the Europeans, Ukraine, NATO would ever be able to push the Russians out of Crimea. Just saying. So, logically, most likely, Zelensky will refuse this proposal. I suspect that over the course of this coming week, there is going to be an extremely tough battle of wills between the Americans and the Ukrainians to bring the Ukrainians into line. And there is no guarantee that this will be successful. And as often happens with the Ukrainians, as has happened in the past, as happened recently during the discussions at Jeddah, it may be that over the course of a meeting, the Ukrainians might say to the Americans that they do accept the American demands. Almost certainly, as soon as that is done, as soon as the Americans have gone away, the Ukrainians will start walking it all back. They will start to insist again that their territorial integrity is not up for negotiation, that Crimea must be returned to Ukraine, that all of their territories must be returned to them, and all of that. So it is no guarantee that this very difficult negotiation between the Americans and the Ukrainians is going to succeed. More likely than not, it will succeed with the Europeans, but there's no guarantee that it will succeed with the Ukrainians. Then the plan is, once the Ukrainians have been pressured into accepting the American demands, the Americans are going to present them to the Russians. And my guess is the idea is to send Witkoff again to Moscow, carrying these proposals, to have another hours-long meeting with Putin in the Kremlin, probably, or in St. Petersburg or somewhere else, and try to get Witkoff to talk the Russians round. And that brings us back to Eve Smith's article. because the Russians, based on everything they've said, are almost certainly going to say no. And it could be, it might have been the case once, that the Russians would have said, look, this is simply not acceptable. We're not prepared to agree to these proposals, but they are a big step forward over what we had before. And we are prepared to negotiate on some of this, and we're prepared to agree to a ceasefire in the meantime. But there are immediate problems which make it, I think, all but certain that the Russians will refuse to do even that. The first and obvious one is that there is apparently a continued commitment by the United States and the Europeans throughout any period of ceasefire to continue to arm Ukraine. Now, Putin has already said that that is unacceptable. He's already said that Ukraine and the Western powers have used all previous ceasefires to re-equip and rearm Ukraine so that when the war resumes, Ukraine is in a stronger position than it would otherwise have been. The Russians have Ukraine on the ropes. They're not going to let them off this time, having been tricked into that before. That would be the Minsk agreement and what happened all over again, and the Russians have already rejected that. Putin himself told Trump when they spoke back in March that for there to be a ceasefire, all military aid, not just American military aid, all Western military aid and intelligence sharing to Ukraine needed to stop. Now, I am sure that is what the Russians will say again, because otherwise they will say to themselves, well, Mr. Witkoff is coming with some interesting ideas. He appears to be accepting, the Americans appear to be accepting that Ukraine will not join NATO, for example, and that Crimea can indeed be ours. But there's lots of things in these proposals which are impossible for us. Handing over the Zaporozhye nuclear power plant to the United States being one, for example. And what we're likely to see, again, if we agree to this, if we agree to a ceasefire on the basis of these proposals, is another negotiation that goes on for years, leads nowhere. Ukraine, in the meantime, rearms with American help. It develops a much more powerful military, even than the one it had at the start of February 2022. And we end up being in a worse position than the one we were then, and in a far worse position than the one we're in now. So the military provisions about Ukraine's armed forces essentially make it impossible for the Russians even to agree to a ceasefire on the basis of this proposal. And then there is the other factor, which is this idea about sending European troops into Ukraine. The Russians have repeatedly rejected that. Kellogg favors it. The proposals made to the Russians apparently make no allusion to it. But the British and the French have already said that they're prepared to do it, even if the Russians don't agree and if the Americans don't provide a backstop. All that it requires is Zelensky to suggest it, and the British and the French troops will just go in. And the Russians have repeatedly said that that is unacceptable also. So, we're going to see a difficult, complicated negotiation between the Americans and the Ukrainians over the course of this week, dragging on for this week. Perhaps Zelensky will crack and will give a verbal support for this proposal, though my own view is that he will walk it back immediately afterwards, as he walked back all the concessions that were made in Jeddah. But the proposal will then be taken to the Russians, and the Russians will say, look, this simply will not do. We cannot accept this. It doesn't address our fundamental security concerns. We don't know what will ultimately happen about Ukraine's NATO membership. It's all very well for Mr. Trump to say that Ukraine should not be a member of NATO. But what about his successors? And these provisions about the Ukrainian army and about the presence of European forces on Ukraine make even the idea of a ceasefire impossible. And of course, we're not prepared to make concessions on the status of the 4 regions because we cannot. These are under our constitution part of Russia now, and we have no scope to compromise on this. Suggestions that some people make that we can swap territories, territory in Kharkiv for territory in Zaporozhye, is something which is impossible and which we are simply not in a position to do. So, there it is. That, I think, is where this whole thing will then come unstuck. Now, I don't think the Russians will want to slam the door. What they will say to the Americans probably is this: look, this proposal, it doesn't go anywhere near far enough, but it does contain some constructive ideas on NATO membership, on the status of Crimea, and things of that kind. Let us begin, finally, a proper negotiation. And then we can talk all this through, and perhaps over weeks and months, perhaps even years, we might reach a mutually acceptable position. What you are presenting us with as a kind of ultimatum is something we simply cannot agree to. But if you are presenting it to us as a basis of discussion, well then by all means, let's have that discussion. But don't expect us to agree to a ceasefire on the basis of this proposal. You've seen the story of the energy truce and of the Easter truce shows that unless a ceasefire is properly monitored, it cannot work. And as the experience of what happened after the Minsk agreement also shows, what happens in ceasefires, unless there are special provisions to prevent Ukraine rearming, what then happens is that Ukraine simply rearms, and we are left in a worse position than one we were in before we came to the agreement. So I think that is what the Russians are going to say. Now, again, there's going to be much criticism, much talk about the Russians spinning things out. But there's 2 things to say here, and that is that these points that I make do not depart in any substantive way from well-known Russian positions. The Russians have expressed all of these concerns many times. They've explained many times why they cannot agree to the kind of ceasefires that people are saying, why the subject of NATO membership needs to be resolved in the way that I've just discussed, why Ukraine cannot be allowed to have large armed forces. It is unrealistic to expect the Russians simply to change their position on any of these issues, especially in the event that they're confronted by a kind of take it or leave it proposal of this kind. They won't take it, they will leave it. And there might be anger and criticism of this. But heavens knows the Russians have had to absorb so much anger and criticism directed at them over the last 3 years, and by the way before, that I don't expect that that's going to concern them unduly. So, sitting down and negotiating about all of these things and taking Russian proposals or counter proposals into account is the correct way to take negotiations like this forward. Doing things the way the West always does, the way that Eve Smith spoke about, conducting the negotiations internally within the West and then presenting a package and then expecting the other side simply to agree, is a trap. It is completely misguided. What needs to happen is that now that the United States has at last formulated a negotiating position, is for the United States, instead of saying that it's going to storm out of the discussions and leave everything to take its course, what the United States needs to do is to set up a proper negotiating team. The Russians will then do the same. There can be meetings in some neutral capital, perhaps Jeddah or Riyadh. The negotiating teams can meet and talk and discuss things with each other. As I said, this will take months and years probably before a final understanding of each other's positions is fully reached. But that is the way negotiations of this kind have historically always been conducting. Presenting demands and ultimatums and making threats which the other side will consider empty, is a complete waste of time. As I said, all that it does is that it guarantees that the negotiations to settle the conflict will never, properly speaking, take place. When the Americans and the Russians met in Riyadh back in March, when Rubio and Lavrov met in Riyadh, I remember that there was talk then of the Americans appointing a high representative to take the negotiations forward, and of the Russians doing the same when they knew the status of the person who the Americans intended to appoint. And I assumed that that would lead to the formation of proper negotiating teams and a proper process of negotiation, such as I remember from the Cold War, such as I remember from the Vietnam negotiations, and if you go back further, from the Korea negotiations, to take the process forward. I never imagined that it would simply mean appointing Witkoff to travel to Moscow every couple of weeks to meet with Putin and to have long and interesting discussions with Putin and with Dmitriev, and then to come back and report to Trump. I never imagined it would be something as, well, basically one-dimensional and even primitive as that. And this then brings me back to Trump and his sense of hurry and urgency and desire to get this all sorted as quickly as possible. Now, there is the question of why Trump wants this and whether he really understands how much more difficult this negotiation really is than it is turning out to be. In my previous program, I think that Trump, confronted with Rubio's and Kellogg's inability to get a ceasefire, has become increasingly frustrated and angry, and he has basically told Rubio and Kellogg, look, this is your last chance, get this deal done this week, or I finally walk away. And I believe this to be true. The question is why Trump ever expected that it would work out like this. Why he thought that a deal with the Russians over Ukraine could be achieved so quickly. I wonder, and I've gradually come round to the view, that Trump has accepted much of the narrative that exists about Russia and about the conflict in Ukraine. He probably does believe by now that the Russians are suffering these hundreds of thousands of casualties and that their army is exhausted and run down and that the war is taking this terrible toll on Russian society. He probably also believes, and he has said as much, that the Russian economy is in dire straits and that it urgently needs sanctions relief. I think, like an awful lot of Americans, he also believes that the Russians at some level yearn for sanctions relief and a rapprochement with the United States, and that they're very restless and unhappy about being overshadowed by China, and that the Russians are desperate to escape this Chinese embrace and to rush into the embrace of the United States. I remember how about a year and a half ago, I attended a debate on X Spaces, and two of the participants in that debate were Vivek Ramaswamy and Elon Musk. And both of them seemed to think that if there was some kind of a ceasefire or a freeze of the conflict lines in Ukraine in return for sanctions relief offered to the Russians would seize on it, and that this would be a good way to try to pull the Russians away from the Chinese orbit. And I remember trying to explain to these two extremely intelligent and very well-informed gentlemen that I thought it was a lot more complicated than that, and that I didn't think that this took into account Russian thinking and Russian concerns. And of course, this was a brief discussion, and we weren't able to go into immense details, and no doubt they did hear what I said, but obviously, over such a short discussion, it was impossible to get this message across. The point is that this is what Ramaswamy and Musk thought then, and I assume that it is what most people in the Trump administration also think. As I've discussed in recent programs, the tariff war against China has evolved into a geopolitical conflict with China. Whether that was Trump's intention originally or not, that is what it has in effect now become. The United States is openly pressuring various countries around the world to side with it in this tariff war against China. And by the way, the Chinese Foreign Ministry today has pushed strongly back. It's come back and said that China is firmly opposed to any party striking a deal at the expense of the Chinese side. If such a situation arises, China will never accept it and will take countermeasures in a resolute and reciprocal manner. China is determined and capable of safeguarding its own rights and interests. Well, the reality is that if you're trying to isolate China economically, then you have to break this connection between China and Russia, because even though Russia is not China's biggest trading partner, not by a long way, not in terms of the financial value of the trade that passes between these two countries. One of the basic mistakes that Westerners repeatedly make is that they assess a trading relationship, the importance of a trading relationship, purely in terms of monetary value, and do not look at the strategic importance of the goods supplied. If China is going to go into a long-term confrontation with the United States, then it needs secure sources of food, energy, and raw materials in order to withstand whatever pressure upon it that the United States imposes. That, I think, is much more important than any of the financial issues that people debate. There's discussions, for example, about whether or not China can divert imports through other countries to the exports through other countries to the United States. I believe it can, and I believe it will, by the way, but I'm not going to discuss this in detail now. But if we are in an economic war, which has become a kind of geopolitical conflict, then of course a lot of the economic criteria start to shift. We start to get out of that geopolitical conflict a military build-up on each side. All of that spare capacity that might exist in China could be used to build armaments, ships, tanks, aircraft, drones, in quantities that the United States would not be able to match. Bear in mind that China has vast spare capacity. The United States doesn't. China can supply itself with all the consumer goods that it needs out of its own production. And if it's not exporting, it can also use that spare production that would then exist in order to re-equip its armies, if it came to that. As I said, the entire calculus of economics then changes. But China does need the food and raw material and strategic minerals that would enable it to make that kind of strategizing possible. And of course, Russia is the key. Russia can supply them to an extent that no other country can. And because China and Russia are neighboring states, they can supply them without the risk of direct American interference, American blockades and seizing of ships on the high seas and that kind of thing. Though there would no doubt have to be a rerouting of trade links and many things of that kind. But again, people underestimate the speed with which that can be done. So I wonder whether, again, the assumption was that the Russians are in a weak position over Ukraine. Their army is exhausted, their economy is in crisis. They yearn to escape the Chinese shadow. They yearn to re-embrace the United States because, well, they're more like Westerners after all than they are like Asians, and they're more like us than they are like them. So it's only natural that they should be our allies against the Chinese. And why the United States, and maybe that is why the United States thought that if it presented the kind of plan that Kellogg is presenting, the Russians would jump for it, and that would then put the Americans in a stronger position to face off long-term against China. And bear in mind, that might explain the urgency. That might explain why Trump wanted it all sorted out with the Russians over the course of his first 100 days. That might explain his urgency now, because if he's going to avoid a long-term conflict with China, economic conflict with China, which would expose more and more problems within the American economy, he needs that deal with the Russians to isolate the Chinese now. Now, maybe I'm oversimplifying. Maybe it isn't like that at all. But if those were the calculations, then in every single part they are wrong. First of all, the Russians will not sacrifice their relationship with China in order to improve relations with the United States. They have said that repeatedly, and they rejected that idea when it was proposed by Biden at his Geneva summit with Putin in June 2021. Secondly, the Russians are not under the kind of military and economic pressure in Ukraine that the Americans appear to believe that they are in, which would make them desperate for a compromise on American terms. Just saying. So this whole calculation, this whole idea of peeling Russia off against China, making some concessions to the Russians on Crimea and that kind of thing, and lifting sanctions in order to pull the Russians away from the Chinese, it isn't going to work because it misunderstands the existential importance for the Russians of the conflict in Ukraine. And it misunderstands also the depth and extent of Russia's strategic partnership with China. Now, Xi Jinping is coming to Moscow in a few weeks. The Chinese ambassador in Moscow, as I recently discussed, is talking about gas exports to gas imports from Russia, about power of Siberia 2. I, for one, would not be surprised at all if we finally saw the signature to the outline agreement for power of Siberia 2 signed in Moscow over the course of Xi Jinping's visit. Just saying. Anyway, there we are. Now, let's just quickly turn to the military situation. And I'm going to say a little quickly about this. After the Easter ceasefire, the Russians resumed their attacks on Ukraine. There was another mass uranium-2 and missile strike right across the territory of Ukraine last night. Hundreds of drones operating, large numbers of missiles of indeterminate nature also launched as well. It's clear that there is no slackening of the Russian military effort despite the 30-day ceasefire. And, well, there have been more reports that the whole situation on the front lines continues to move further in Russian favor. It looks as if Ukrainian defenses, not just around Konstantinovka, are crumbling, but also that the Russians are now making further progress around Pokrovsk, and importantly, that the Ukrainians were able to gain no advantage out of the 30-day ceasefire, the 30-hour ceasefire. They don't seem to have been able to strengthen their positions to any significant extent. They did appear to have made various attempts to regain territory, but none of this appears to have succeeded. So the Russians no doubt continue to feel that the war is going to their advantage. There are indications that inflation in Russia is going to start falling in May. They're expecting to get a renewed commitment from China, maybe in the form of a big gas deal, in a few weeks' time. And in the meantime, Putin is probably going to be visiting India fairly soon. I don't think the pressure on the Russians is anywhere near as great as people in the United States appear to imagine. Well, there we are. It seems to me that we are in an odd position. If Trump does decide to pull out of this conflict in Ukraine, if he feels so exasperated that he has no choice but to do so, well, as David Ignatius, the American journalist strongly connected to the intelligence community, has said, if that does indeed happen, then the pace of the Russian advance in Ukraine will only accelerate. At some point, probably around early autumn, we could see a full-on military crisis in Ukraine, at which point I suspect demands for Trump to reverse course and to recommit to Ukraine in some form will grow. It would have been much better, therefore, if Trump had not made the mistake of getting drawn into Ukrainian negotiations at all in the first place. But there it is. We're going to have a complex week. The Americans bullying the Ukrainians to accept these proposals. The Ukrainians perhaps pushing back, maybe pushing back successfully, I can't say. But one way or the other, I can't imagine the Russians agreeing to these proposals. Probably, in fact, I can definitely say that the reason they're being quiet about them for the moment is because they're waiting to see if the Ukrainians will reject them. It makes only sense for them to do that rather than to reject them in advance before the Ukrainians do. I mean, it's obvious tactics. But one way or the other, I expect the Russians to reject these proposals. After all, they have already done so now, many times. And, well, we'll see where it all takes us from that point on. Well, this is where I end today's program. There'll be more from me soon. Let me remind you again, you can find all our programs on our various platforms, Locals, Rumble and X. You can support our work via Patreon and Subscribestar and by going to our shop. Links under this video. Last but not least, if you've liked this video, please remember to tick the like button and to check your subscription to this channel. That's me for today. More from me soon. Have a very good day.